On July 4, 1776, the men in the Pennsylvania State House were not posing for a national holiday. They were deciding how a rebellion would explain itself to the world. Philadelphia was hot, the war was going badly enough to make caution sound reasonable, and British power was not an abstraction. It was ships, soldiers, money, empire, and the legal charge of treason. The Declaration of Independence became famous as a statement of ideals, but it began as a dangerous public act. The date itself needs care. The Continental Congress voted for independence on July 2nd, after approving Richard Henry Lee's resolution that the United Colonies were, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. John Adams believed that July 2nd would become the great anniversary. According to his letter to Abigail Adams, he expected it to be remembered with ceremony, games, bells, and illuminations. Yet the date printed at the top of the Declaration was July 4th, the day Congress approved the final wording of the document that would carry the argument into public view. That distinction matters because independence was not only a decision, it was a claim that had to be justified. In June, Congress appointed a committee of 5: Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert R. Livingston. Jefferson wrote the first draft, drawing on Enlightenment language, colonial political experience, and a long record of grievances against George III and Parliament's imperial system. Adams and Franklin suggested changes. Then Congress edited the text line by line. The result was not a private diary of revolutionary feeling. It was a diplomatic, political, and moral indictment. It told foreign powers why the colonies claimed a place among the nations. It told undecided Americans why reconciliation had failed. It told Britain that the conflict was no longer a protest over taxes or representation, but a break with royal authority. The famous sentence about all men being created equal sat inside a larger legal argument about consent, rights, government, and justified revolution. The surviving record also shows compromise. Congress removed or softened passages, including Jefferson's attack on the slave trade, even as the final declaration kept language about liberty that later generations would use against slavery itself. That tension is not a footnote. It is part of the document's power and part of its contradiction. The Declaration announced universal principles from a society that denied those principles to enslaved people, indigenous nations, women, and many poor men. Its words would outgrow the political world that produced them. On July 4th, the immediate problem was more basic. Would the colonies survive long enough for the words to matter? New York was exposed. British forces were preparing a major campaign. The Continental Army was still fragile. Many Americans remained loyal to the crown or uncertain about independence. Congress needed unity, but unanimity was difficult. Delegates came from colonies with different economies, religious cultures, military fears, and political instructions. The Declaration tried to make 13 separate rebellions sound like one people acting with one purpose. The document's structure was deliberate. It opened by saying that when one people dissolves political bands with another, respect for the opinions of mankind requires that they explain their causes. Then came natural rights, consent of the governed, and the right to alter or abolish destructive government. Then came the charges: obstruction of laws, manipulation of assemblies, military coercion, taxation without consent, cutting off trade, and waging war against the colonies. The final passage pledged lives, fortunes, and sacred honor. That promise was not ceremonial. If Britain won, the signers could lose everything. The signing story is often simplified. The famous engrossed parchment was not signed by every delegate on July 4th in a single dramatic moment. The text was approved, printed, and circulated. John Dunlap produced broadsides that carried the Declaration beyond Congress. Public readings followed in places such as Philadelphia and New York. Crowds heard the words aloud before many people ever saw the parchment. The Revolution was an age of print, but also an age of voices in streets, taverns, churches, militia camps, and town squares. Those readings turned argument into allegiance. In New York, after the Declaration was read to troops and civilians, a crowd pulled down the statue of King George III on Bowling Green. The metal was later used for bullets, a symbolic and practical transformation of monarchy into war material. Acts like that did not make independence inevitable, but they show how quickly words could become public action. The Declaration was a text, and it was also a performance of political breakage. For the delegates, the risk was personal and collective. Benjamin Franklin's famous joke about hanging together or hanging separately captures a real danger, even if the exact wording survives through later accounts rather than a perfect contemporary transcript. Treason was the shadow over the room. The men who approved independence were not outside British law, they were challenging it. Their success would make them founders. Their failure could make them rebels remembered by the gallows. The Declaration also changed the diplomacy of the war. A colony asking for relief was one thing. A people declaring itself independent could seek alliances as a new nation. France did not immediately join the American cause because of beautiful prose, but independence made foreign recognition imaginable. The document announced that the colonies claimed the powers to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, and do all other acts independent states may do. That sentence looked outward across the Atlantic. Inside America, the Declaration became a test of political language. Its first audience included soldiers with enlistments, farmers weighing risk, merchants watching trade collapse, enslaved people hearing liberty proclaimed by slaveholders, and loyalists who thought Congress had crossed into disaster. The text did not settle those conflicts, it sharpened them. Independence was not a sudden national consensus. It was a choice made under pressure, then defended through years of war. The mythology came later, but not from nowhere. The parchment, the signatures, Independence Hall, and Trumbull's painting gave the event a visual grammar. A room, a committee, a document, a table, a nation beginning with pen and resolve. Historians have shown that the real process was messier than the painting. Debates were spread over days, delegates came and went, and some signatures were added later. Yet the image remains powerful because it captures a truth about the moment. Ideas had to become an official act. The most enduring part of the Declaration is the claim that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. In 1776, that principle was limited by the assumptions and exclusions of the revolutionary generation. In the centuries that followed, abolitionists, suffragists, civil rights leaders, labor organizers, and independence movements read those words as evidence against the limits of the founding itself. The Declaration became both a birth certificate and an argument Americans kept having with their own history. That is why July 4th is not only a commemoration of separation from Britain, it is a reminder of the cost of making political language public. Congress did not control how later generations would use the Declaration. Jefferson did not control how equality would sound to people he excluded. The signers did not know whether independence would survive the next campaign. They wrote in the space between principle and danger, between aspiration and contradiction, between a British Empire they knew and a republic they could only imagine. That long argument began with practical choices as much as philosophy. Congress had to speak as if the colonies were united, even while the army depended on short enlistments, state politics, local committees, and supplies that were often uncertain. The Declaration therefore did work that a musket could not do. It gave ordinary people a reason to connect taxes, courts, trade, troops, and royal authority into one story of broken consent. It also gave opponents a clear target, which made neutrality harder to maintain. The evidence for the moment is scattered across journals, letters, printed broadsides, later recollections, and the surviving parchment. No single image can contain all of it. The safest way to understand July 4th is to see it as a bridge. After the vote, but before victory. After grievance, but before a working republic. After inherited British rights language, but before the broader democratic meanings Americans would later claim. The men in Congress could approve sentences. They could not guarantee what those sentences would demand from the future. 250 years later, the familiar date can make the event feel inevitable. It was not. The vote on July 2nd, the adoption on July 4th, the Dunlap printing, the public readings, the later signatures, and the long war all belong to a chain of fragile decisions. The past, made clear, is that the Declaration did not magically create a country. It gave a risky rebellion a language of rights, a case before the world, and a promise future Americans would keep testing against reality.